A warning before we start, I will be discussing representations of sexual assault and sexual violence in this essay. There will also be spoilers for some of every Fallout game, Mad Max, and The Handmaid's Tale.
Happy Pride Month, and also my birthday month! Woohoo! I got a device to make my robot arm work with a PS2 controller, and Bloodborne, and Dad of War. Okay, let's do the essay.
From where you're kneeling must seem like an 18-carat run of bad luck. Truth is, the game was rigged from the start.
Fallout New Vegas starts with your character, the POV character, being literally shot in the head, and then dying, and then being resurrected by the futuristic medical technology of the wasteland. As far as game openers go, I give Fallout New Vegas a 10 out of 10. Its Adam Driver creator is a little disappointing compared to Fallout 4, but its storytelling is just wah. As with all Fallout games, there is a variety of freedom of choice open to the player, but the main storyline of the game starts with your quest to find the guys who killed you and get revenge. Playing this storyline brings you to Novak, a small settlement where you find Manny Vargas. If you talk to Manny, you can hear about his problems in the town. He's one of two guards, and the other one, Boone, hates Manny. He thinks Manny sold his wife to Caesar's Legion as a slave, because Manny and Boone's wife were always arguing. And then the slavers took her away, but nobody else from the town. You'll also find out that Manny has the information you need about the guys you're looking for. However, Manny won't tell you his information unless you help the settlement. They need the Repcon facility to scavenge trash from, but a group of ghouls have moved in. You reach Repcon and get inside the building, and there are feral ghouls all over. A voice on the intercom tells you to come to the top floor. You ask who the voice is and it says,
"Who I am doesn't matter, smooth skin."
Smooth skin? The voice on the intercom is a ghoul? Suddenly you aren't so sure about going upstairs, but once you do, the plot thickens even more. The voice on the intercom was Chris Havasam. Chris is not a ghoul, he's a human. But he thinks he's a ghoul. Why? You'll have to talk to him and to his friends and go miles out of your way before you properly understand why. Chris is part of a cult of ghouls who want to use the old rockets at Repcon to leave the misery of planet Earth behind. Great, you can help them with their plan and they'll leave. No reason to kill anybody. But they won't leave until the invisible demons in the basement are gone. And the invisible demons in the basement, who turned out to be super mutants, won't leave until they find the stockpile of invisibility drugs. They can't check the last room for the stockpile because one ghoul is stuck in there and he won't leave until you confirm his suspicions that the mutants killed his friend. So you find the ghoul's friend, find out what happened to the stockpile, and get everybody cleared out. Now you can get Chris's ghoul cult onto their rockets and out of here. But by now, you probably will have tried to convince Chris that he's a human, but he just isn't having it. He tells you how in the vault he grew up in, he liked machines more than shooting stuff, so he was ostracized and made to work on the reactor, which was constantly faulty. At this point, I realized I could just go to Chris's vault and get someone he knows. He'll trust them if they say he's not a ghoul. So I make the journey to Chris's vault, where I find a bunch of ghouls.
Chris's faulty reactor leaked and turned everyone into rabid ghouls. He knows he must be one too, because if not, the guilt of doing that to everyone he knows but surviving himself would be too much to bear. New Vegas doesn't even say this explicitly, and it's not a consensus among fans, but to me the only thing that makes sense is that Chris fled when he feared he'd been irradiated, returned later, found everyone turned into ghouls, and had his suspicions erroneously confirmed.
At the end of this quest, I fast travelled back to Manny to get my information. I did, and then I turned around, and Chris was right behind me. I assumed this was a bug because Chris shouldn't be all the way over here in Novak, and he definitely shouldn't be in Manny's room. But I was wrong, because after all the rockets launch, Chris moves to Novak and starts living with Manny. These two characters are gay, and it isn't even mentioned. These two characters, each with their own backstories and motivations, and Manny with his maybe horrible thing he did to Boone's wife. And that's when you realise why Manny was always fighting with Boone's wife, he was in love with Boone. It's this kind of careful, organic writing that makes Fallout New Vegas so beloved. But more than that, it makes the representation of gay characters in this game totally exceptional. There's a confluence of these well-rounded characters having a variety of sexualities, and these characters not having their sexuality pointed out or shown off in a tokenistic way. and that together is more than the sum of its parts. So let's talk about sexuality in Fallout New Vegas.
Start a nuclear war at the gay bar, gay bar, gay bar.
In many pieces of media that show post-apocalyptic societies, the assumption is that sexuality in a post-crisis society will function mostly the same as it does in ours. A prime example of this structure is The Walking Dead. In The Walking Dead, the main protagonist group functions mostly by the rules of modern society, with similar values and sensibilities, sometimes being tested by difficult decisions. In terms of sexuality and relationships, the characters are mostly free to do as they please in the main protagonist group, and there are some homosexual relationships throughout the series. The main protagonist group encounters other groups of survivors, usually with different values to their own. When they encounter other survivors who function similarly to them, they typically assimilate them or are assimilated by them if it's a larger group. The driving conflict of the series is almost always between the main protagonist in-group and some out-group with whom they do not see eye to eye.
The Walking Dead shows an example of a post-apocalyptic world from the point of view of a group of people who uphold the values and structure of real-world American society, at least in some ways. The assumption of this projection is that after the apocalypse, eventually we would rebuild society more or less as it is now.
Another famous piece of apocalyptic fiction, which was actually an inspiration for the aesthetics of Fallout 3, is Mad Max. The Mad Max series is a useful example of a comparison here, as it not only mostly revolves around the individual, but most groups of people in the Mad Max universe are gangs rather than large societies. These gangs may together form communities, but there is a strong sense of territory and insularity, and the world appears mostly anarchistic. To be clear, when I say anarchistic, I'm referring to a power structure with little or no hierarchy. There is some misconception on what an anarchist is, mostly arising historically from US political purges of anarchists in the 19th and 20th centuries. So a lot of people will be picturing a young person with colourful hair and a baseball bat who wants to do the smashy, which isn't wholly wrong, but... Okay, this video isn't about this. For our purposes, an anarchistic structure is one with no central power system containing many groups or individuals. I also have to talk about Mad Max here, as it would be remiss to ignore the franchise in which gangs of men and women rove around doing as they please in leather BDSM gear 24/7. That said, looking at Mad Max online, I found a lot of people straight up denying that there is anything gay whatsoever in Mad Max. There is apparently much debate over whether, for example, the Golden Youth is Wes's sexual partner, even though George Miller has said that this character was originally female and was made male deliberately to show that gender roles and sexuality are a free-for-all in the wasteland. This not only demonstrates an incredible skill level at outright denial, but to me serves as an example of why more representation is so important. If people can look at Lord Humongous and tell themselves, nope, nothing gay about that, we're just going to have to keep writing gay characters until people can accept that being gay is normal, and if a character seems gay, that's fine. In Fury Road, although the authorial intent is notably feminist, again I have seen some people claim there is nothing feminist in Mad Max Fury Road. The society as Max finds it is incredibly patriarchal, worshipping masculinity and obeying the laws set down by a much smaller, almost entirely male higher stratum. This society is larger and more hierarchical than others seen in the series so far. The anthropological message here could be interpreted as that as societies get larger and more hierarchical, they can go anyway but have a tendency to form harmful systems.
The world of Mad Max is an example of a post-apocalyptic future where societal limitations and expectations of sexuality are thrown out in favour of a more sexually uninhibited culture. Fury Road, however, seems to warn that as larger power structures grow, starting in such a dire place, the sexual free-for-all might become a sexual free-for-some, unless fair treatment is protected.
In Margaret Atwood's novel The Handmaid's Tale, now a popular television series, the United States has become a totalitarian regime following nuclear war, and one of the knock-on effects of that is that fertility and birth rates have plummeted. As a response to this population crisis, the far-right traditionalist government have enslaved all fertile women and given them to powerful couples as handmaids, to then become surrogate mothers. The purpose of the book is really twofold. First off, it serves as an allegory for the way that men and women are complicit in the oppression of themselves and each other in a patriarchal system. Secondly, it uses the heightened fictional example to show that modern society commodifies reproduction and the sexuality of women. The way that allegory works is that it creates a more extreme version of the existing society and lets the audience examine the consequences of choices in that extreme version and then compare them to their own lives. In this story, anyone you talk to could be a spy and have you taken away. In reality, anyone you talk to might judge you, and people might push you away for behaviour that goes against societal norms. In the story, men and sometimes their wives are assumed by the women to be having carefree lives because the system was created for their benefit, but of course, men are miserable in their own ways too, and their wives are having a shit time. In reality, the patriarchal society we live in puts pressure on men as well as women, while men are assumed by some to have simply better lives, even if the system we have wasn't consciously designed for this purpose. This is of course a big part of the reason for the meninist reaction to feminism, where men see women talking primarily about their own suffering and feel the need to tell everyone how men suffer, while not acknowledging that women's complaints are legitimate and also not understanding that feminism is aiming to defeat the system that makes both groups suffer. However, let's get back to the second purpose of our story. The story wants us to understand that in reality, our society treats women's sexuality as a resource. And to demonstrate this, we are shown a situation in which population is in crisis, and therefore that resource is required by the state. In Handmaid's Tale, the state of Gilead has seized the resource of women's wombs, in the same way that a state in a time of famine might subsidize farms and then seize surpluses of food. It is fascinating but also really scary that this metaphor actually predicted the rhetoric and ideas of the far-right movements in America today. The rhetoric of the alt-right has been using a supposed population crisis to talk about birth rates and fertility in white Western women, and then like clockwork it has progressed on to talking about incels and state-assigned girlfriends. Of course, there is no population crisis in America. Racist political commentators have just abused and misused statistics and used illogical data comparisons to fearmonger about the Great Replacement and white genocide. Personal sexuality in Handmaid's Tale is also strictly policed. Only heterosexuality is allowed by law, and anyone practicing any other sexuality is branded a gender traitor and executed, either by hanging or being worked to death in a concentration camp. In the case of one fertile woman who's discovered to be gay, Gilead allows her to live but executes her infertile partner and performs a clitoridectomy on her.
To recap, there are different projections in media of how a post-apocalyptic society might function, sexually and romantically. Some show societies in which the status quo as it is upheld in an attempt to rebuild normality. Some show an anarchistic world in which sexuality is actually more free than it is now because the apocalypse has thrown out the bad societal structures along with the good. Others show a fascist control over sexuality, usually as an attempt to control birth rates and reproduction.
So how does Fallout as a series fit into this? Well, in general, the Wasteland is accepting of different sexualities, but in earlier games, actual representation was few and far between. Since Fallout 1, female player characters have been able to engage in same-sex pairings with sex workers, but no gay NPC couples were present and male players could not be gay. Actually, in Fallout 1, the player character will be able to flirt with the Brotherhood of Steel Guard, but regardless of gender, he's not interested. I mean, if that's not real equality, what is? In Fallout 2, 1998, the player character can have sex with either Davin or Miria in the town of Modok, regardless of player gender. Choosing to do this, however, will result in their father Grisham forcing the player character to marry his child. Although it's not correct to say that this is the first example of a same-sex marriage in a video game, it is probably one of the first dozen, and the fact that people seem to think it is an indicator of its general renown and therefore influence culturally. Fallout 3 features yet again the ability for player characters to hire female sex workers regardless of gender, but for the player character that about wraps it up. There are however 2 gay couples in the game, and most people read Anthony Ling as gay as well, which, as he's a game character, is an example of gay coding which is also literally gay coding. The Fallout series as a whole seems to follow the Mad Max route when it comes to sexuality. The inhabitants of the Wasteland are a merrily mixed bunch, but in more militaristic factions such as the NCR or the Brotherhood of Steel, there's a little more implied homophobia. But how does New Vegas specifically fit in? Well, buckle in my gay friends and gay adjacent spectators because New Vegas is about to take you for a ride. Being set in Vegas, the game was always going to feature an abundance of sex workers, but there aren't simply more than in other games. There are key differences to them too. This is the first in the series to feature male sex workers, and even a Protectron robot that can be reprogrammed as a robotic prostitute as part of a quest. He's called Fisto, Fully Integrated Security Technotronic Officer.
I will require a hardware and software upgrade to offer enhanced services.
Anyway, in New Vegas, the player character's options for engaging romantically and sexually aren't simply limited to sex workers. Fallout has always had perks for player characters which allow flirting, Lady Killer and Black Widow, but New Vegas is the only game in the series to introduce gay perks. Confirmed Bachelor is a perk available to male player characters named after the euphemism from the 1950s meaning a gay man. Cherchez la femme is a perk available to female player characters, named after the French expression which means, when there's a problem, look for the woman behind it. These perks allow same-sex flirting that in some cases lead to romance, but also, due to the wealth of gay NPC backstories in New Vegas, afford the player opportunities at multiple points to just show sympathy and connect with gay NPCs. Confirmed Bachelor even allows a player to tell Cass that they aren't interested in her romantically when she flirts with them. At that point, the game is allowing players to opt out of heteronormativity. It's hard to articulate what a big deal this is, but here's my best attempt without screaming. If you'd never played a game before that would let you flirt with the people you were interested in, but instead the media around constantly pumped stories at you that didn't properly fit your real life experience, this moment alone might well just kill you and then bring you back to life and then shoot you to the moon and then blow your mind. On top of that, with the confirmed Bachelor perk, male players can flirt with Major Knight, a soldier in the NCR, and ask if he wants to be friends. Major Knight reacts positively to this, but he says that friendships are not approved of in the NCR. Without this interaction, we wouldn't have this information about the NCR, which no matter how you feel about it, you have to agree is a good measure of their character. Confirmed Bachelor will also let male players flirt with Jack at the Nellis airbase, only to have him completely miss the point and talk about a girl he likes instead. Possibly the most relatable gay experience the game could have included. Additionally, there is a companion that will only join male players who have confirmed Bachelor, and only if you flirt with him and impress him just right. That's right, he's your in-game boyfriend. He's a medical researcher with the NCR. His name is Arcade Gannon, and he's kind of a jerk. Well, at the very least, he's a bit of a hot mess. He has this quite big-headed need to do something that will make big waves for the whole of society, but at the same time he's very insecure and self-deprecating and constantly worried that his father wouldn't approve of the things he's doing, and paranoid to boot. Having had to hide his sexuality from his colleagues, he's gotten used to being very impersonal with everyone. Once again, this kind of rounded, three-dimensional character writing for a gay video game character feels so rare, if not unprecedented. Gay women don't really get the same representation as gay men do in New Vegas, and pretty much no opportunity for romance, but there is a story involving a lesbian character that really kind of blows me away. Corporal Betsy of the NCR at Camp McCarran is gay, but she was sexually assaulted by a man. And since then, she's been aggressively flirting with any women she encounters. And if the player is female, they can experience Betsy's cringeworthy and frankly creepy attempts at seduction firsthand.
Girl, you are some grade A poon. Anybody ever tell you that?
Although I hadn't thought about it before encountering this story, it makes sense that survivors of sexual assault might feel the need to aggressively reassert their sexuality. And a quest available to the player will include the option to talk to Betsy and persuade her to seek professional help. I mean, you can also go and kill the guy who assaulted her and bring her his head, but that's okay, not everyone has to do the healthy thing every time. All this is to say that Fallout New Vegas has a wealth of gay representation, and in each case, the sexuality of the character is either incidental to their personality, or it's an important point to understand and explore an issue. It isn't ever tokenistic, nor is it the butt of a joke, with the exception of Fisto.
Enhanced services.
I would say that with the caveat that there are, however, no trans characters anywhere in the game, which is a real letdown.
Returning to our earlier question, however, New Vegas has a fittingly complex and well-considered depiction of societal attitudes towards sexuality. Different groups have different levels of tolerance and acceptance. The NCR, as we've learned, doesn't view homosexual relationships in the military kindly, but also doesn't appear to be outright homophobic in its treatment of its citizens. The Brotherhood of Steel, a more dogmatic institution focused on tradition and also being quite insular, is less accepting than the NCR. Veronica Santangelo, a Brotherhood scribe, will reveal to interested players that she used to be in love with another woman in the Brotherhood, but the woman's parents, also Brotherhood members, were insistent that she should only be in a procreative relationship, so she left.
And although some bad people think that Christina Royce from the DLC isn't Veronica's girlfriend, she is, and I can prove it, and I heard that those people smell bad and are mean to dogs.
New Vegas, by contrast, is a sexual free-for-all. In Vegas, the typical wasteland approach, or Mad Max approach, that sexuality and gender roles are defunct in the society and people should just do what they want, seems to be the prevalent attitude. Caesar's Legion, by contrast, the fascist imperial faction of neo-Romans from the east, seem to be comparable to the Handmaid's Tale. Or to put it another way, they have Ayn Rand's approach to sexuality. People should be free to do as they please, but also women aren't technically people. Actually, Caesar's legion have such an interesting branch of backwards fascism that they're going to need their own separate section in this essay. So, section 3, do as the Romans do. But what do the Romans do? This is a tricky question for a few reasons. Firstly, there are differing reports on the attitudes towards sexuality in Caesar's legion, and even the reasons behind those different reports are ambiguous. Secondly, what is said and what is done are not always the same, especially as representation of different sexualities in media often comes down to just what is implied. Thirdly, Caesar's legion don't necessarily actually do as the Romans do, or did. And fourth, even if they did, some of the same problems plague our understanding of Roman sexuality anyway. So let's untangle those points in no particular order. Representation and implication. I hope this one is fairly self-explanatory. When it comes to representation of sexuality in media, implication is sometimes the best it's going to get, so you need to be prepared to infer the hell out of some gay relationships.
This does mean, though, that the official stance on sexuality in Caesar's legion is a little hard to glean. Unless Caesar were to state both his decreed law and the general consensus at some point in the game, we can't really expect to see an abundance of gay relationships, or definitively not see them. That said, I don't really know how you can definitively not see all the Romans being gay.
Different hot takes on homosexuality in Caesar's legion. Major Knight, when telling you that the NCR military won't view a friendship very kindly, also says that friendships are more generally accepted in Caesar's legion. The problem with this is, how does he know? Knight has probably heard about this through other NCR soldiers who he himself is saying in the same sentence are pretty homophobic. And as the legion are their enemies, who's to say NCR aren't saying that to belittle them? However, Cass would agree with Major Knight on this. You remember Cass from earlier, she's the lady the player can refuse to flirt with thanks to the confirmed bachelor perk. Anyway, when you do so, she'll say,
"Guess you've got a legion outlook on things. No problems here. There's a lot more of that in the Mojave than you see."
Additionally, Veronica Santangelo, the lesbian Brotherhood scribe, says the legion
mount each other as much as they mount their women, so maybe they did keep a little something from the Empire. No such privilege for the women, though. Figures. So, to answer your question, they're a bunch of hypocritical jerkwads. It's a word.
A big problem, however, is that someone a lot closer to the issue says the exact opposite. Jimmy, a male sex worker, used to be in a relationship with a centurion in the Legion, and tells you that in the Legion, homosexuality is punishable by death.
One reason you might suggest why these accounts are contradictory is, what if the game developers changed their position on this issue halfway and didn't update all the characters? In response to this, I'll probably deploy my lazy media critic parachute and scream, "Death of the author!" as loud as I can until you go away. Another solution is that Caesar's legion is a growing power, covering a large area, and opinions and attitudes might change from person to person and place to place quite a bit. This is undoubtedly true in the actual Roman Empire. The outsiders to the legion might also be making up their minds based on what's known about the actual Roman Empire, and not the legion directly.
So, the actual Roman Empire. In the actual Roman Empire, male homosexual relationships were generally accepted, although there was a strict societal expectation of a power dynamic. Therefore, men who had sex with men of lower status were seen as dominant, and their perceived masculinity was not impacted. Generally, if a man took the submissive role, he was considered lesser. There are, however, notable examples of this being contradicted, including the marriage of Emperor Nero, in which Nero took the role of the bride. The key to understanding this system was that Roman society was heavily patriarchal, and masculinity was a value held in very high esteem. Masculinity, of course, though, is just a fairly arbitrary set of characteristics that have nothing to do with men or women inherently. And if you were, say, the emperor, you could feel pretty comfortable being the submissive partner. Who cares what masculinity even is? If you say this dude isn't right, he'll just have your head chopped off. When I say that we have a similar problem as understanding Roman sexuality as we do sexuality in the Legion, partly what I mean is that, similarly, there is an issue of having the image painted by their enemies. For a long time, the Romans were thought of as simply dropping trow, or I guess toga, for anyone and everyone all day, every day. This comes from reports of Roman society and sexuality given by Christians, who were not keen on Romans for a long time. Female homosexual relationships were less acceptable to ancient Romans, as female sexuality and thereby reproduction were considered essential to the stability of their society. Ovid even called lesbianism freakish, and a desire known to no one. Feel free to think of Ovid as a massive wanker, and you'll be in good company.
All of this is to say that the Roman idea of sexuality was much more linked to gender than it was to heterosexuality versus homosexuality. It was more about an individual's masculinity or femininity, since masculinity was such a critical component of Roman society. In this way, the Legion are probably similar to the actual Romans, because their religion is the cult of Mars, the god of war.
But Caesar's legion aren't the Romans. Well, of course they aren't. But the ways in which they're different are quite interesting, and particularly for our examination. Let's start with how they're similar. There's the aesthetic, the Latin, the slavery. Dale Barton, a trader who supplies Caesar's legion, says that he can move freely without guards inside legion territory due to their total control, which was true in the Roman Empire too. Caesar claims to be the son of the god Mars, which, yep, that's an on-brand thing for a Caesar to do. If anything, it's less egotistical than the claims a lot of ancient Caesars made. Dale Barton also says that the legion requires less tax than the NCR, which apparently was true for Roman citizens too. In both cases, again, due to the slavery, both societies suffer from a sequel, that is to say, Second Emperor problem. Although Caesar has expanded the legion from nothing into the empire it is currently, it's generally agreed that Linnaeus, the second in command, could be the end of the legion due to infighting. Possibly the biggest weakness of empires is this line of succession. Just because one emperor has been prosperous does not mean that his son won't be a total lunatic who literally sets the capital on fire, or sleeps with both his sisters and starts a brothel in the royal palace. It would be simplistic to say this is exactly true for Rome and its first emperor Augustus, as his successor Tiberius wasn't too bad. However, Augustus was very successful in his 40-year reign, and some of the Caesars after Tiberius were total horror shows. Both societies are focused more around conquering their neighbours than befriending them. The Romans actually had the same word, hostis, for both enemy and foreigner. The reason for this attitude, however, is the start of the deviation between them. It's fairly well known that the Romans justified their military strategy as defense. Attack those guys before they attack us. Caesar's legion, however, are more classic supervillain types, bent on world domination just because they want to be the biggest and the toughest. Another key difference is the treatment of women. Women in the Roman Empire could not be full citizens with full rights and could not hold elected office, but were generally held in high regard. Important men in Rome were expected to have hives? What? Important men in Rome were expected to have wives who could entertain guests and hold parties and maintain the household, and women could sometimes be politically powerful through private negotiations. This gave rise to accounts by some misogynist critics of Rome that Rome was secretly run by women.
Population growth as a strength of the empire was a concern for Augustus, who gave special privileges to women for having children. If a citizen woman had 3 kids, or a freedwoman had 4, she could actually inherit money and basically run her own shit. And if she had a husband, he would be exempt from community commitments, which shows that Augustus had at least some kind of expectation for fathers to be involved in the raising of children. Caesar's legion, on the other hand, as an army first and society second, sees women as subhuman. Although similarly invested in population growth, rather than rewarding families for having kids, Caesar is actively punishing anyone found to not be involved in sufficient baby making. Caesar's legion's approach seems most similar to the state of Gilead in The Handmaid's Tale. Women are seen as a resource, and to meet their goals, the state has seized control of that resource.
The important thing to bear in mind about the legion is that they fucking suck. They enslave and crucify people. They have the motivations of a mustache-twirling villain. They treat women as subhuman. The design of the legion, I feel, is even done to make sure you understand that they're just lame assholes.
Silliest dressed band of raping, slaving marauders you'll see east of California. I'll say that. Where's that touch of old world class?
The Praetorian Guard, for example, have this regal Roman armor, but they'll almost always have a punk haircut or tinted sunglasses. Look at that guy. And while some of them have spears or swords, most of them carry guns, which just makes them look lame. People who cosplay as powerful armies from the past are sad nerds, and Fallout New Vegas wants us to know that. Where I live, Generation Identity has been increasingly active among the groups of racist right-wing idiots. And they're regularly seen with round shields displaying the symbol Lambda. This is supposed to represent the Spartans who fought at the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BCE. Of course, where Generation Identity and their 4chan friends most likely know Thermopylae from is Zack Snyder's movie 300, in which an angry Scottish man leads a bunch of rip bros to their death against effeminate girly man Persians. There is So much wrong with the film 300, ranging from the weird homophobic racist overtones to the fact that Snyder just co-opted a large part of history to push his libertarian agenda, to the fact that most of our ideas about Spartans being super manly men were perpetuated, exaggerated, and in some cases created by literally Hitler. At the Battle of Thermopylae, between 4,000 and 8,000 Greeks, yes, a mixture of Greeks, not just Spartans, held off tens of thousands of invading Persians for 7 days before almost all dying because, well, there were fucking tons of Persians. At the same time as this, an alliance of Greeks met the Persians at sea, winning a series of much more important battles that ultimately stopped the invasion. The myths of how nobly and strongly the Spartans fought spread and grew wilder and wilder. They became part of the hyper-macho mythos surrounding the Spartans and were picked up 2,500 years later by this chap, who told all his friends about how this was because the Spartans were racially purer. 70 odd years after that, our pal Zach makes a film about them, playing up as much as possible the idea that the Spartans were the only ones who would stand up to this sweeping Persian empire which was going to assimilate their Western culture, and even though he definitely only meant to inspire individualist freethinkers like him, he ends up throwing petrol on the already raging dumpster fire of online neo-Nazism. Oops. Maybe fewer racists would like his film so much if he included the bit where 60 years later the Spartans allied with the Persians to try to win a squabble with Athens. All this is to say that Generation Identity, neo-Nazis, and Caesar's Legion are birds of a feather. They're appealing to the cultural memory of a historic power to try to give themselves more legitimacy. The reason I'm making this point is that for the purposes of understanding the sexuality in Caesar's Legion, it is important to understand how much they actually understand and resemble the original Romans. So back to our question. Caesar's Legion, who do they fuck? Do they fuck dudes? Let's find out. I think it's pretty likely that given the multiple accounts of male homosexuality in Caesar's Legion, it's probably socially acceptable, but at the same time, legally prohibited. In other words, the Legion probably turns a blind eye to gay relationships as long as their goal of population growth isn't impeded. To recap, the Legion are possibly accepting of homosexuality in men, although it's hard to tell, and they definitely aren't accepting of it in women. What I want to focus on more though is, Caesar's Legion are just the bad guys of Fallout New Vegas.
Even in an open world franchise, promoting free will and choice as much as possible, they just objectively suck. They enslave people, they treat women like animals. Maybe worst of all, they're sad lame nerds. Just like the Romans, they're worshipping this sort of masculine ideal, but in their worship of it, they've become the peak of toxic masculinity. They're aspiring to be something they can neither ever reach nor fully understand. I killed Caesar the first time I met him on my first playthrough of the game, because he's just a bad fucking dude who needs to get turned into soup. Does that make me a hero? Yes.
Section 4. The Nuclear Family versus the Nuclear Apocalypse. I've watched north of 20 hours of YouTube videos in which people argue about which is the better game out of Fallout 3 and Fallout New Vegas. The best of these videos, by a ways, is Fallout 3 is garbage and here's why, by Hamburger Guy. The second best is Fallout 3 is better than you think, by Many a True Nerd. As it turns out, Fallout 3 is garbage, but it's better than I thought. The reason I'm bringing this up is that in this section I'd like to talk about representations of families in Fallout, and I'm saying Fallout because New Vegas specifically is actually devoid of families. There are a few children running around in Vegas with apparently no parents, and various couples throughout, but no families. So, in Fallout 1 and 2, families and children are all over the place. There are many quests that involve children. Finding missing children, finding children's missing parents, giving a child a gun so he'll accidentally murder his father with it. And one of the notable controversies around Fallout was the ability in those first games to kill children. Versions of Fallout 1 sold outside the US had child sprites cut from the game due to this, and when Fallout 3 was under development, caught between the rock and the hard place of letting players do whatever they want and letting players murder children, Bethesda decided to make children invincible.
Don't worry, I'm just noting this as a thing that happened. I'm not about to defend child murder as an unalienable right of gamers everywhere.
Killable kids.
Making Ross
oh
is looking...
yeah. The game really should have been like this from the start.
I actually feel really bad, I don't know why.
In Fallout 2, as I mentioned before, there are some quite complex interactions you can have with the character Grisham and his family. If your charisma is high enough, regardless of player gender, you can have sex with either Grisham's son or daughter. However, Grisham will burst in mid-coitus, and then depending on the intelligence level of the player character, he can either be convinced you are just performing a doctor's exam, or he will force you into a shotgun wedding with his child. The deliberate indifference to the gender of the player is very much on brand for Fallout. The shotgun wedding is a bit of dark humour that juxtaposes a progressive view on sexuality with a very old-fashioned idea of monogamy. There's also the Bishops, an organised crime family in Fallout 2. John Bishop, the head of the family, promises the player their choice of partners, male or female, if they join. Leslie Ann, John's wife, is frequently unfaithful, and the player character can sleep with her regardless of their gender. Their daughter Angela can also be seduced, but she's strictly straight. I mean, I guess somebody had to be. These families both demonstrate a positive attitude, or at least indifference towards non-heterosexuality, which is nice, considering how often queer folk are framed as the ultimate enemy of the nuclear family. There are also lots of orphans or possibly neglected children running around in these games, which is something Fallout 3 tackles pretty effectively. In Fallout 3, there is a town called Little Lamplight, a settlement made up entirely of children. The original town, situated inside Lamplight Caverns, was founded by a group of schoolchildren who survived by being deep inside the caves during the nuclear strike, but 200 years later the population is most likely made up of runaways and orphans, as the children kick out any residents over the age of 16. This is kind of an interesting thing to see, as it suggests an awareness of shifting family dynamics, and potentially of the fact that some communities would have to raise children as a group. Additionally, the lesbian couple in Fallout 3 have an adopted son. There's an unfulfilled potential in Fallout games to explore the different ways that families could be structured and children could be raised. Fallout New Vegas was developed in only 18 months, and I think the lack of children and families may have something to do with that. I think that Fallout New Vegas, with the amount of development time of Fallout 3, or Fallout 3 with the writers of New Vegas, would have shown more of this. Little Lamplight demonstrates the necessity of different social structures to look after children in a world where parents are frequently murdered or neglectful. And New Vegas, as a whole, shows a world where societal pressure is lifted off of non-heterosexual people. Maybe a Fallout game could have explored communal parenting, or very, very widespread adoption systems, or something else we can't quite picture. Instead, Bethesda hints at these possibilities and does nothing with them. And New Vegas didn't have the time to write more than a dozen children into the whole game. This is quite a shame to me, but unless another Fallout game is developed by Obsidian, I don't think we're really going to see anything like this. It might seem odd that I've just given examples of Bethesda representing unusual families and Obsidian not, and then I'm claiming the potential is with Obsidian, so I should explain. Fallout 3 and 4 are centered around families. In Fallout 3, finding your character's single father is the driving force of the plot. In 4, finding your character's son is the driving force of the plot. However, although your character's mother in Fallout 3 was going to be a black woman, which probably would have made some waves socially, instead she was entirely cut out and not shown. She was always intended to die in childbirth though, so what Bethesda decided to remove was only visuals showing her there, and though I can't know for sure, that feels like a decision to hide her in order to not upset people who would have been upset by her presence. In Fallout 4, your character is in a heterosexual marriage and has a child as part of the premise. And although you can have same-sex romances with companions, and even multiple partners, it doesn't feel fleshed out or carefully written. Even the people I've seen praising these types of relationships with companions have suggested it's more to do with developer oversight rather than conscious, careful writing. And worse, Fallout 4 removed the confirmed bachelor and cherchez la femme perks.
New Vegas has such clever, considered writing. Every quest and story has the ability to make you laugh or cry, and can spin on a dime to do either. You can be hiking up to Jacobstown to get brain surgery for a robotic dog of the leader of a gang of Elvis impersonators, and suddenly you arrive and Jacobstown is a super mutant town, and the leader is Marcus from Fallout 2, and he tells you that he named Jacobstown after a friend. And suddenly you have dust in your eye and you have all these allergies, and why were you chopping onions anyway? And that's why I'm saying that Bethesda can't deliver the representation Obsidian can. If Fallout 4 lets you have multiple partners, but none of them acknowledge each other and neither does the game, it isn't allowing polyamory, it's allowing infidelity. If the game lets you have same-sex relationships, but it isn't treated with the thoughtful acknowledgement of gayness that New Vegas has. It isn't representing gay people. It just doesn't give a shit.
Bethesda keeps rushing out open world games without the care and attention they deserve. They pile their efforts into a technical system like Fallout 3's VATS Gore, or Fallout 4's Companions, and they skimp on the writing. The reason I say we won't get a good exploration of these dynamics with Bethesda could be summed up like this. Fallout 3 might be better than I thought, but it's still garbage. Of course, I'm happy to be proven wrong, so now I'll do the thing that I learned from the hours of my life spent watching Fallout fans argue on YouTube. Talk directly to Bethesda as if they care what I think. Bethesda, if you're watching this, please prove me wrong. Section 5. Conclusion. Before we go, I'd like to talk about a Fallout Wiki fan thread I found while researching this. It was posted back in 2010 and it's called, "What's with all the homosexuality?" But sadly, it isn't a Seinfeld bit. The OP writes quite insensitively and with lots of quite clunky slang, which means they're probably either a 13-year-old boy or a total shithead. The main post goes pretty much how you'd expect, talking about homosexuals this and chicks that, and wrapping up everything with a classic, "Now I don't have anything against homosexuality" statement at the end. When I found this thread, I felt quite let down. And reading the main post and the first replies was a real chore. Here we go. Unnecessary representation, pandering. There's actually someone who says that this doesn't feel like proper representation, which kind of makes me chuckle because honestly, if this isn't proper representation, what is? Obviously, this commenter just wants to use an impossibly high hypothetical standard to shut down any attempts to be inclusive at all. However, as I continued into the thread, I saw a few things that filled me with hope. Firstly, the majority of commenters on this thread were saying that they actually loved all the homosexuality. The community really took this dude to task here, and I love that. The responses were great, and they ranged from "listen up, shitbird" to really informative comments that did their best to help this person understand why they were wrong. One commenter wrote,
"I think when nuclear war has obliterated almost all infrastructure in the world, it's obvious that gays aren't your real enemies. As a gay man myself, it's nice to play a game where our existence isn't completely denied. Because of society's attitude to non-heterosexuality, people notice when a character is LGBT. It's still a bit of a surprise, and it sticks out like a sore thumb, not only in video games, but in other forms of media. But inversely, imagine playing a game intended for adults, with male and female characters and no reference to any sort of sexual interaction at all. Wouldn't it feel a bit lacking? A bit like you as a player were being ignored? Well, that's what it feels like for LGBT people all the time. You aren't forced as a player to explore the LGBT issues in FNV, and that's fair enough, but it's nice for them to be there. A lack of characters of different ethnicities or of women would seem really odd, especially in our current day and age where equal representation is expected of any forward-thinking game developer like Obsidian who know their audience, young people who are always the vanguard of social liberalisation. Moreover, I think that representing the personality traits that make characters distinct, the spice of life if you will, fleshes out both the individual characters and the wasteland as a whole.
The second thing that made me hopeful, slightly counterintuitively, was one of the straight commenters complaining. He was complaining that there weren't enough heterosexual options for romance in New Vegas. On the face of it, this is pretty annoying, for hopefully obvious reasons. However, there's another side to this.
This commenter isn't just moaning that the gays have something he doesn't have. He's seeing how well written and engaging those stories are, and he's saying he wants that too. First off, this means he's experiencing firsthand, for real, what the other commenter was suggesting hypothetically. He's seeing in this game what gay people experience all the time, and I think that'll make him understand eventually. More than that, when he does come around, and he will, he's looking at the representation in New Vegas, and he isn't calling it tokenistic or fake or pandering. He's acknowledging how well written it is, and he's saying he wants more content like this.
Fallout is about people. It's about characters that you can laugh at, or fear, or hate, but you never stop to question whether they're people, because they're so real, and because they're so real, no matter how else you feel about them, you also love them. When you interact with the NPCs in a Fallout game, they don't just say things that feel real, they say things that stick with you. I'll let you know when I see a line in any media, not just a video game, better than, "I don't think I can continue to have done the things that I have done in the name of progress and healing."
Fallout is about characters that you love. And that's why I subtitled this essay, An NPC Love Story. As well as the care and attention and love that the creators of this game obviously put into it, love is a tangible presence in the game. On top of the queer NPCs, there are just love stories everywhere. There's Jack and Janet, there's Sammy and Pauline, even Old Lady Gibson's getting some action. These characters were made to be loved, and this game just gives us new ways to love them. I said earlier that the things New Vegas does are more than the sum of their parts. And by writing these gay characters, by including those perks, by giving the player these options, Fallout New Vegas is letting queer players know that they're loved back.
I'd like to thank Hann The Mann for creating all the awesome music used in this video, as well as all the people who proofread and discussed and helped me revise and polish this essay. It's been a big one, and it's taken a lot of work, and it's meant a lot to me. I'd also like to thank you, the viewer, for watching this all the way to the end. You didn't have to do that, so I guess I'll put a blooper on the end as a treat. If you'd like to support Curio, you can visit the Patreon. And if you'd like to support Curio but you're broke like me, you can subscribe to the channel and just let all your friends know about it, and it'll still be a good time. Until next time, stay curious.
The Legion's approach is most similar to The Handmaid's Tale. The state has